Hi, I'm Stephen Travers. When I look at drawings of architectural landscapes, I often see the same sorts of mistakes creeping into drawings. So in this video, I'd like to show you three of them. My thoughts as to why we might draw this way, but also what I think is a better way. Hope you find this helpful. The first mistake we're going to look at is when we actually know too much about a subject, and that becomes a problem for us actually drawing it. Let's have a look. I often see drawings that look a bit like this. Let's do a shop front, shall we? And this shop front has a nice big window, display window, next to its door. It's a bay window. It's a window that curves out. And what I end up seeing are these curved lines here. Now that's because if we were to look at our window from the side on, in fact it does curve out. But the problem is, in this view, standing looking straight at it, we don't see those curves. In fact, our bow window is going to look flat. And the reason we do this is because in our mind, we know that the window curves out. Even though in the particular view I have on it, in the perspective with which I'm looking at this window, these curves can't be seen and they just appear straight lines. What's happening is what I know is affecting what I draw rather than restricting myself to what I see. I'll show you another example. Domes are a very common object to draw. We often see domes from afar, but again, what I see is a desire to put curves here and here and here, which if we look at our reference photo, aren't there. That in fact, from the perspective we're seeing this tower and dome, these lines are straight. But because in our mind we know that if we look down on this structure, it's round, we want to somehow show that roundness. And so we put these curves in here. When the truth is that from the position we're viewing this structure, we don't see the curve at all, and it's actually a straight line. It confuses the view. Something doesn't look quite right because we've introduced, if you like, different perspective schemes into the one drawing. There are always things we know about an object that we have to leave out of our drawing because they're simply not relevant to that view. A second area where I think we commonly make technique choices that perhaps aren't as helpful as others is in the area of hatching and cross-hatching. Let's have a look. So in a pen drawing, one way of adding shade is through what we call hatching. What we're trying to do is simply to, if you like, colour in parts of our paper to make them darker. And hatching is this. Hatching is when you do it in one direction. And then cross-hatching is when you bring lines across in the other direction that cross the ones you've already done. All of this part of the column are in shade, and so I'm applying cross-hatching. Now this piece at the top of the column is set back slightly from the piece of stone or timber that sits on top of it, and so the shadow only comes part of the way down there. And then on this side of the column, the hatching's the same. We can vary the amount of hatching we do to make some parts darker than others, and we might want to do that here just to make the background a bit darker to help the column stand out more. This basically is how a lot of hatching, cross-hatching that I see looks. But the problem is it ends up flattening our subject because it doesn't take into account the form, the shape of the object that is under it. Let me show you what I mean on our second column. So we have a column. Now we know a column is round, and we know therefore that the front center part of the column is going to be closer to us. And because it's closest to us, it's going to be a little more in the light. So I want to kind of show that with this. Now we have this piece on top, which comes out a little bit more. This sort of like I think of these as like cushions, pads on top of the... And it has a slight curve, and so I want to be showing that. Can you see how I'm now using the form of the object itself, the curvature of it, to help me decide how I'm going to hatch? And so for this section behind, I'm just going to do straight down. Can you see how I've tried to show it with my hatching? This is a curved surface which therefore finds the light differently, and I've tried to indicate that. I've used up and down lines because that reflects the actual smooth straight shapes of the objects that I'm shading. I'm free to do more shading in some parts to help show the form. This little bit is only just tucked under this ledge, and so it's getting more light on it, so I can afford to show the fact that it's not as dark. For these deeper shade bits at the back, I can put a lot more lines in than I put elsewhere. When we look at this second example, we get a sense of the curvature of the column much more. What we want to avoid is applying hatching or cross-hatching that makes no allowance for the surface shape, for the roundness in this case of the column. The third area I want to look at is how we tackle the tricky question of how do we draw trees? How do we represent leaves? Let me show you. A third common mistake relates to drawing trees. It's where we draw a foliage pattern. Sometimes what we know about something we're drawing actually gets in the way of our drawing. If I'm drawing a tree, I know it's covered in leaves. I feel the need to draw those leaves, and yet there are so many I can't draw them all. So what do? One way I often see is to end up with this rather detailed, complex, all over line pattern. It becomes this all over tangle of line that we know represents leaves. But rather than actually drawing what we're seeing, it's like we've drawn a symbol for leaves. And so we know this means it's covered in leaves all over. And if the bottom of the tree is darker, for instance, we might draw more of our line leaf pattern there. I'll just slip in another common mistake. And that's that the trunk is too fat. Can we imagine this trunk branching into branches and those branches disappearing into little twigs that finally come to just inside the leaf line? Or is there too much thickness in our trunk to spread out, if you like? So how should we be drawing a tree? The important thing is not to think about leaves at all, but to think about outline and the overall form that we're seeing. I like to imagine trees as having, if you like, fabric, something that clings and molds to the shape, and that becomes then what I draw. I draw the shadows, that the curvatures over the surface of the canopy as a whole. I don't think about individual leaves at all, except do a few little specks to indicate individual leaves at the very outskirts on the silhouette of our drawing, because silhouettes are very important. I have a couple of videos that deal with drawing with trees where this is all explained and demonstrated in more detail. But this is a very, what I think, common mistake. And the other thing is to have a strong sense of where the light's coming from. So in this drawing, the light's coming down from this direction, because that will affect what gets thrown into shade. That will all help show us the form of the object, because light does help define the form. But because it's from fairly high up, it is going to be darker down the bottom. And so you can see me now cross hatching over the top of my hatching. And so there we have a simple tree that just took moments to draw, but it so much represents a tree, and it gives us a sense of reality and three-dimensionality and the shape of a tree. Whereas applying, if you like, a leaf pattern over the surface of the tree, again, it really flattens it. It's like we've cut out a pattern and glued it over the silhouette of the tree. Try and avoid thinking about the leaves. Look at the overall shape and draw the overall shape, the light and the shade, where the highlights are and where the shadow moves in. And use hatching to create variance in your shadows, which is what happens in trees. They are irregular. Ironically, that can make them harder to draw than something that is a more symmetrical shape. My trick, my hack for trees is don't think of leaves, look at the overall outward form of the tree canopy and draw that. I hope that was at least interesting. And if you have any issues with any of those three areas, I hope it was also helpful. But of course, the most important thing is to have fun when we're drawing. So have fun. I'll see you next time. Bye.